Today, we're exploring every fighter aircraft that became a flying coffin in World War II, starting with number 1 Brewster Buffalo, United States, 1939. When the Brewster Buffalo entered service with the United States Navy, it was considered a modern fighter. By the time it reached the Pacific, it was already obsolete. Pilots flying it against Japanese Zeros over Malaya and the Dutch East Indies found themselves in a nightmare. The aircraft was too slow, too heavy, and dangerously unresponsive at altitude. British and Dutch pilots reported catastrophic loss rates, with some units losing over 80% of their Buffaloes in combat. The machine that was supposed to defend Allied positions in Southeast Asia became the aircraft most associated with early Allied failure in the Pacific. 2. Ferry Battle, United Kingdom, 1937. Britain entered the war with the Ferry Battle as its primary light bomber on the Western Front, and within weeks, the consequences were devastating. On the very first days of the Battle of France in May 1940, formations of battles were sent against German columns advancing through Luxembourg and Belgium. Flying without adequate fighter escort, they were picked apart by Luftwaffe interceptors and ground fire. Losses exceeded 40% in single missions. The aircraft was underpowered, poorly defended, and wholly unsuited to daylight operations against a modern enemy. Crews flew them knowing the odds were nearly unsurvivable. 3. Blackburn Rock, United Kingdom, 1939. The Blackburn Rock represented one of the most deeply flawed tactical concepts of the early war, a carrier-based fighter armed entirely with a rear-facing turret, carrying no forward guns whatsoever. The thinking was that it could fly alongside bombers and provide defensive fire, but in practice, the turret added so much weight that the aircraft could barely reach 220 miles per hour, making it slower than many of the bombers it was supposed to protect. In combat operations over Norway and in the North Sea, it accomplished almost nothing. Pilots found it unmanageable, and the Royal Navy quietly withdrew it from frontline service within a year. 4. Bolton Paul Defiant, United Kingdom, 1937. Like the Rock, the Bolton Paul Defiant was built around the turret fighter concept, and for a brief moment over Dunkirk in 1940, it achieved surprising success. German pilots initially mistook it for a Hawker Hurricane and attacked from the rear, flying straight into its guns. But once the Luftwaffe understood its configuration, they simply attacked from the front and below, where the Defiant had absolutely no defensive capability. In August 1940, during the height of the Battle of Britain, entire Defiant squadrons were devastated in single engagements. One squadron lost 6 aircraft in less than an hour. It was withdrawn from daylight operations and reassigned to night duties, where it performed adequately. But its daytime combat record was a catastrophe. 5. Curtiss P-36 Hawk, United States, 1938. At Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, among the few American fighters that managed to get airborne during the Japanese attack were several Curtiss P-36 Hawks scrambled from Haleiwa Airfield. They claimed 2 kills, but the P-36 was already a generation behind by that point. Against Japan's more agile fighters, it lacked the speed and rate of climb necessary for effective interception. France had used it against Germany in 1940, with similarly mixed results. The aircraft was not fatally flawed in isolation, but in the combat environment of the war's most critical early engagements, it consistently proved outclassed, and pilots paid the price for that gap in performance. 6. Fokker D, XXI, Netherlands, 1938. When Germany invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, Dutch pilots climbed into their Fokker D XXIs and flew directly into one of the most overwhelming aerial campaigns of the war. The D-XXI was a capable design for its time, fixed undercarriage for machine guns, reasonable maneuverability, but it was completely outmatched by the Messerschmitt Bf-109s it faced. The Dutch Air Force lost the majority of its D-XXIs in 4 days of combat. Pilots flew with extraordinary courage, but the aircraft simply had no answer for a faster, better-armed adversary. The entire Dutch air defense collapsed not because of poor airmanship, but because the equipment was a generation too old. 7. Moraine Saulnier MS-406, France, 1939. France went to war against Germany in 1939 with the Moraine Saulnier MS-406, as its most numerous fighter, and that fact alone tells a grim story. The MS-406 was underpowered, outpaced by the Bf-109 by nearly 60 miles per hour, and structurally fragile under combat stress. French pilots reported that it handled poorly at high speed and was prone to engine failures in cold weather, a severe disadvantage during the winter and spring campaigns of 1940. Despite their efforts, MS-406 pilots suffered enormous losses during the Battle of France. The aircraft was not a death trap by design, but fighting a superior enemy in an inferior machine produced the same result. Number 8. Potez 633, France, 1938. The Potez 633 was a twin-engine light bomber that France exported to Romania and Greece while keeping a small number for its own forces. In Greek service during the Italian invasion of 1940, crews flew it on ground attack missions against Italian columns in Albania, dangerous work in any aircraft, and in the Potez, doubly so. The aircraft had inadequate defensive armament, poor speed, and a bomb load that barely justified the risk of the mission. Romanian crews flying it on the Eastern Front suffered severe losses to both Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It was an aircraft that asked more of its crews than it could ever return in battlefield value. 9. Gloucester Gladiator, United Kingdom, 1937. The Gloucester Gladiator holds a peculiar place in the story of the Second World War. It was a biplane fighting a modern war. When Italian forces invaded Malta in 1940, a handful of gladiators, reportedly just 3 at the most critical moment, flew daily interception missions against waves of bombers. The pilots were brave beyond measure, but the Gladiator was fabric-covered open cockpit and armed with 4 light machine guns. Against monoplanes with cannon armament and retractable undercarriages, it was not a contest. The fact that Malta survived those early raids had more to do with Italian caution than with Gladiator capability. 10. Hawker Audax, United Kingdom, 1932. Used in the early months of the war in secondary theaters, including the Middle East and East Africa, the Hawker Audax was an Army cooperation biplane that had been obsolete even before hostilities began. Crews assigned to it in 1939 and 1940 were effectively flying museum pieces on operational missions. It had no meaningful combat capability against modern fighters and only marginal utility against ground targets. Its continued use reflected the desperate shortage of modern aircraft in British secondary theaters, not any faith in the aircraft itself. For the men who flew it, being assigned an Audax was an indication of just how thin the RAF's resources were stretched in those early years. 11. PZL P-11, Poland, 1934. On September 1, 1939, Polish fighter pilots launched themselves into the sky in PZL P-11S against the incoming Luftwaffe, knowing their aircraft were hopelessly outmatched. The P-11 was a high-wing monoplane with fixed undercarriage, a maximum speed of around 242 miles per hour, and a ceiling that the Bf-109 could surpass with ease. Polish pilots were skilled, aggressive, and determined, but they were flying an aircraft that belonged to an earlier decade. They scored kills, and they disrupted German formations, but the losses were unsustainable. Poland's air force was effectively destroyed within a week, not because of a lack of courage, but because of a catastrophic mismatch in equipment. 12. Avia B-534, Czechoslovakia, 1935. Czechoslovakia's Avia B-534 was considered among the finest biplane fighters in the world when it entered service. But by the time German forces absorbed the country's military assets in 1939, it was already obsolete. Ironically, German and Slovak forces pressed, captured B-534s into service, and Slovak pilots flew them against the Soviet Union in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. Flying a biplane on the Eastern Front in 1941 was an exercise in futility. The aircraft had no answer for Soviet monoplane fighters, and Slovak units equipped with it suffered losses that reflected the impossibility of their situation more than any failure of airmanship. 13. Caudron C-714, France, 1940. The Caudron C-714 was designed as a lightweight fighter, a theory that sounded promising but proved disastrous in practice. Polish pilots who had escaped to France after their country's fall were assigned C-714S and told to defend French airspace. They were appalled. The aircraft had a structural weakness in its wing roots that caused panels to detach under combat maneuvering loads. It was also slower than expected and dangerously fragile. Polish pilots, who had already survived one catastrophic air campaign, found themselves in an aircraft they genuinely feared. Several were lost to structural failures in flight, not enemy action. It was withdrawn from combat after just weeks of service. 14. Fokker TV, Netherlands, 1937. The Fokker TV was a twin-engine medium bomber that the Dutch had placed significant confidence in as their primary offensive strike aircraft. During the German invasion of May 1940, TV crews were ordered to bomb German forces advancing across Dutch territory. Flying without fighter escort in daylight, they were devastated by Bf-109 interceptions. The aircraft's defensive armament was entirely inadequate, and its speed offered no refuge. Most of the operational TV fleet was destroyed within the first 2 days of the invasion. The missions accomplished little, and the crews were sacrificed in operations that bordered on suicidal given the tactical situation. 15. Lavochkin-Gorbanov-Gudkov Lag, 3. Soviet Union, 1941. Soviet pilots had a name for the Lag, 3. They called it the Varnished Guaranteed Coffin, a grim play on the abbreviation of its designers' names. The aircraft was constructed primarily of a bonded wood composite called Delta Wood, which was heavy and absorbed moisture over time. It was underpowered, sluggish in maneuver, and difficult to recover from spins. Against the Bf-109F that the Luftwaffe was operating in 1941 and 1942, it was at a severe disadvantage. Soviet pilots were assigned it in enormous numbers during the most desperate phase of the Eastern Front, and losses were catastrophic. The Lag-3's reputation among those who flew it was one of dread. 16. Bell P-39 Airacobra, United States, 1941. The P-39 Airacobra was an aeronautical curiosity. Its engine was mounted behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a long shaft, which placed the pilot sitting in what amounted to the most structurally vulnerable position in the aircraft. American pilots found it dangerously prone to entering flat spins, from which recovery was nearly impossible. In the Pacific, it was outclassed by Japanese fighters at altitude. Yet the Soviet Union, which received thousands through Lend-Lease, used it effectively at low altitude on the Eastern Front. For American and Allied pilots flying it in the conditions it was not designed for, the P-39 was a machine that required constant respect and frequently did not forgive mistakes. 17. Douglas TBD Devastator, United States, 1937. By the time of the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Douglas TBD Devastator was the oldest aircraft in frontline carrier service with the United States Navy, and it showed. Torpedo squadrons, flying Devastators, were ordered to attack the Japanese carrier fleet in a coordinated strike that, through breakdowns in communication and timing, became an uncoordinated slaughter. Torpedo Squadron 8 launched 15 Devastators, not one returned. Other torpedo squadrons suffered comparable losses. The aircraft was too slow to evade the Zero fighter cover, and its torpedoes required a dangerously low and straight approach run. Midway effectively ended the Devastator's career in a single catastrophic morning. 18. Nakajima B-5N Kate, Japan, 1938. The Nakajima B-5N, known to the Allies as Kate, was a remarkably capable torpedo bomber in the early war years. It attacked Pearl Harbor and helped sink American carriers at Coral Sea and Midway. But by 1943, its lack of defensive armament, modest speed, and complete absence of armor protection made it extraordinarily vulnerable. As American fighter defenses improved, Kate crews were sent on missions with little realistic prospect of survival. The aircraft that had been a lethal weapon in 1941 had become, by the middle of the war, an aircraft whose crews understood they were flying into increasingly one-sided engagements. 19. Aichi D-3 Val, Japan, 1940. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber, designated Val by the Allies, opened the attack on Pearl Harbor and sank more Allied naval vessels than any other Axis aircraft in the early war. But like the Kate, Its career traced a steep arc from dominance to disaster. Fixed undercarriage, limited range, no pilot armor, and a maximum speed that American fighters could comfortably exceed meant that by 1943, VAL crews were suffering heavy losses on every operation. In the later stages of the war, surviving VALs were repurposed as kamikaze aircraft, the ultimate indicator that Japanese command had concluded the aircraft and its pilots were more valuable as guided weapons than as conventional strike platforms. 20 Mitsubishi G3M NEL, Japan 1936. The Mitsubishi G3M, codenamed NEL, was the backbone of Japanese naval land-based bombing in the early war, and it achieved a historic distinction on December 10, 1941, when G3M and G4M crews sank the British battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off Malaya. The first-time capital ships underway at sea were sunk by air power alone. But the G3M carried almost no defensive armor and had fuel tanks that ignited with alarming ease. By 1942, losses to Allied fighters on missions across the Pacific were severe. Crews who survived early missions knew that continued operations in it amounted to diminishing odds with each sortie. 21 Mitsubishi G4M Betty, Japan 1941. If the G3M was vulnerable, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty was infamous. American pilots called it the Flying Lighter. Its unprotected fuel tanks ran the full length of the fuselage and ignited so readily that a single burst of fire could turn it into a fireball in seconds. It carried Admiral Yamamoto on the flight that was intercepted by American P-38s in April 1943, and the aircraft crashed, killing everyone aboard. Despite this notoriety, Japan continued using the G4M in large numbers because it had no adequate replacement. Crews flew missions knowing that any penetration by enemy fire was likely fatal, not merely dangerous. 22 Ilyushin IL Sturmovik, Soviet Union 1941. The IL Sturmovik was one of the most produced aircraft in history, with over 36,000 built, and it played a decisive role on the Eastern Front as a ground attack platform. But its story in this context is instructive. Early variants were designed as two-seat aircraft, and when production pressures forced a single-seat configuration, the removal of the rear gunner left the aircraft fatally vulnerable to attack from behind. German pilots discovered quickly that approaching from the rear was almost entirely safe. Soviet losses among IL-2 crews were staggering. Stalin himself reportedly sent a message to aircraft factories declaring the IL-2 as necessary to the Red Army as air and bread. The two-seat version was eventually restored, but not before enormous losses had been paid for the single-seat mistake. 23 Heinkel He-111, Germany 1936. The Heinkel He-111 was Germany's primary medium bomber of the war, used from the Spanish Civil War through the final weeks of the conflict in Europe. Over Britain in 1940 and 1941 during the Blitz, it faced hurricanes and Spitfires and sustained losses that Luftwaffe commanders found increasingly difficult to absorb. Its speed was insufficient to escape British interceptors. Its bomb load was modest for a twin-engine aircraft, and its defensive armament, while improved in successive variants, was never truly adequate. Crews on night bombing operations over Britain experienced terrifying encounters with radar-guided defenses. The He-111 that had terrorized Warsaw and Rotterdam became progressively more vulnerable as Allied defenses matured. 24 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, Germany 1936. Few aircraft in the Second World War were more psychologically effective in their moment of dominance, or more catastrophically exposed when that moment passed than the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Over Poland, France, and the Balkans, its accuracy and its wailing siren made it a weapon of terror. But during the Battle of Britain, when Spitfires and Hurricanes intercepted formations of Stukas without the fighter escort they required, the result was butchery. In 1 week in August 1940, so many Stukas were destroyed that Goering withdrew them from the battle entirely. The aircraft's fixed undercarriage, low speed, and inability to defend itself made it entirely dependent on air superiority. And the moment that superiority disappeared, so did the crews. 25 Junkers Ju-88, Germany 1939. The Junkers Ju-88 was perhaps the most versatile aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory, serving as a bomber, dive bomber, night fighter, torpedo bomber, and reconnaissance platform. But its story as a flying coffin comes from its later use in the Mistel composite weapon program, where stripped Ju-88s packed with explosives were flown unmanned into targets, guided to release by a fighter mounted above. More directly, crews flying bombing missions deep into Britain and the Soviet Union in standard variants faced increasing losses to improve defenses. The aircraft served throughout the war in part because Germany had nothing better, and the men who flew it in the later years did so against dramatically worsening odds. 26. Dornier Du-17 Germany, 1937. The Dornier Du-17 earned the nickname, the Flying Pencil, for its unusually slender fuselage, which made it one of the harder bombers for German designers to equip adequately. Its bomb bay was narrow and limited payload significantly. By the Battle of Britain, it was already nearing obsolescence, and losses over England in 1940 were heavy. In one of the most documented actions of the battle, a single Dornier Du-17 was brought down near Buckinghamshire by a Hurricane pilot who had exhausted his ammunition and rammed the aircraft. Both machines crashed. The Du-17's limitations were known to its crews, who could not compensate with bravery for what the airframe could not provide. 27. Fiat CR-42 Falco, Italy, 1939. Italy entered the Second World War with a significant portion of its fighter strength consisting of biplanes, and the Fiat CR-42 Falco was the most numerous among them. It was the last biplane fighter to see combat anywhere in the war, and in its own performance envelope, low-altitude maneuvering against similar aircraft, it was genuinely exceptional. But against British Hurricanes over North Africa and East Africa, it was simply outclassed in every meaningful performance category. Italian pilots of skill and courage flew it against modern monoplanes and suffered predictable results. The Falco's survival in frontline service through 1941 reflected Italy's industrial inability to transition fully to modern fighter aircraft, not any confidence in the design. 28. Fiat G50 Freccia, Italy, 1938. The Fiat G50 Freccia was Italy's first all-metal monoplane fighter, and it should have represented a meaningful step forward. In practice, its performance barely exceeded that of the biplanes it supplemented. Armed with only 2 machine guns, it was underarmed by the standards of any major air force. Italian pilots flying it over Malta found themselves in engagements with Hurricanes and later Spitfires, where the outcome was rarely in doubt. The aircraft's open cockpit, retained by request from Italian pilots who preferred the visibility and feel of it, created additional drag that compounded its performance deficiencies. It is a curious footnote that pilot preference contributed to the aircraft's technical inadequacy. 29. Macchi C-200 Setta, Italy, 1939. The Macchi C-200 had the distinction of being genuinely pleasant to fly, maneuverable, forgiving, and honest in its handling. Pilots generally liked the aircraft as a machine. What they could not forgive was its armament. 2 12.7mm machine guns with a total offensive capability of a fighter operating in the same airspace as aircraft carrying cannon. Over Malta, over Greece, and over the Soviet Union, where Italian forces participated in the Axis invasion, C-200 pilots repeatedly found themselves unable to deliver the weight of fire needed to destroy enemy aircraft, even when they achieved advantageous positions. The engine was also problematic, prone to oil leaks that coated the windscreen and degraded forward visibility at critical moments. 30. Reggianari 2000 Falco, Italy, 1940. The Reggianari 2000 was a fighter that showed genuine promise, and yet seemed cursed at every turn. Italy's Regia Aeronautica declined to order it in significant numbers, finding the design's fuel tanks, located in the wing roots without self-sealing protection, too dangerous for frontline service. Hungary and Sweden both purchased it, and Swedish aircraft were used as trainers. Hungarian RE-2000S flew on the Eastern Front against Soviet opposition with limited success. The aircraft that Italy's own Air Force judged too dangerous to issue to its pilots was therefore flown by Allied nations in combat, which speaks to the particular nature of the decision to reject it. If there's another World War II fighter you think deserves to be called a flying coffin, share it in the comments below. For more stories of the deadliest aircraft, forgotten designs, and wartime aviation history, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.